There is a county on the Atlantic edge of Nova Scotia that held 18,320 people at the census of 1901. The last count found 7,373, 60% of a population gone, not in a disaster, but slowly, across 120 years, one departure at a time. In the same province, an hour from those emptied harbors, the average house sells for close to $600,000, while out on the fishing coast, a sound 3-bedroom home facing open ocean can struggle to find a buyer at 80. The sea built every one of these places, and the sea took the reason away. 13 of them are stranger and lonelier than anywhere else in the province. What keeps the last porch lights burning? Hit subscribe. I promise this is worth your time. Long before any of this carried a market price, the peninsula belonged to the Mi'kmaq, who moved with the seasons between the rivers and the shore across a homeland they call Mi'kmaqi, and whose presence here runs back close to 11,000 years. The French came ashore at Port Royal in 1605 and raised the first permanent European settlement north of Florida, and the Acadians who followed walled out the sea rather than clear the forest, diking the salt marshes of the Annapolis Valley and the Minas Basin, and farming the reclaimed mud for 5 generations. In 1755, the British began the deportation, and roughly 10,000 Acadians were loaded onto transports and scattered from Massachusetts to Louisiana, their villages burning behind them. A stubborn remnant came back, and the ground left for them was the ground nobody wanted, the rocky islands of the Strait of Canso, the wind-scoured western shore of Cape Breton. New England planters took the emptied Acadian farmland through the 1760s, and the American Revolution delivered the next wave. Between 1783 and 1784, roughly 33,000 Loyalists came ashore, close to tripling the colony's population inside 18 months, and among them were more than 3,000 Black Loyalists who founded Birchtown outside Shelburne, the largest free black settlement in North America at the time. The 19th century belonged to wood, wind, and water. Shipyards worked in almost every navigable cove: Maitland, Parsboro, Advocate, Bear River, Port Greville, and by the 1870s, the province stood among the world leaders in building and owning wooden sailing ships, with vessels registered in tiny harbors, carrying salt fish to the West Indies and timber to Liverpool. Iron hulls and steam engines ended all of it. The yards fell silent through the 1890s, and the coastal villages lost the industry that had paid for their churches. Beneath the northeastern corner of Cape Breton lies one of the richest coal fields in the country, running out under the floor of the Atlantic. The Dominion Coal Company, formed in 1893, eventually worked 12 collieries and accounted for something like 40% of all the coal mined in Canada. A steel mill opened at Sydney in 1901 and was briefly the largest steel producer in North America. Immigrants poured into Whitney Pier from Newfoundland, the Caribbean, Italy, and Lebanon to feed the coke ovens. Ottawa created the Cape Breton Development Corporation in 1967 with an explicit mandate to run the mines while phasing them out. The federal government announced its exit from coal in January of 1999. Phelan Colliery closed that September with 400 workers laid off in a single stroke. Prince Colliery, the last one, wound down on the 23rd of November, 2001. The steel mill stopped making steel in 2000. Leaving behind the worst contaminated site in Canada, roughly 500,000 tons of poisoned sediment across 34 hectares of tidal estuary, and a cleanup that cost $400 million and finished in 2013. The fish mattered more, because the fish were everywhere. In July of 1992, Ottawa closed the northern cod fishery, and the groundfish closures that spread along the Atlantic coast cost Nova Scotia alone something in the order of 20,000 jobs. Entire villages had been built around a single plant that took cod, haddock, and pollock off the wharf and sent it out in boxes. When the boxes stopped, the wharf stopped. Lobster and snow crab eventually replaced the lost value and more, and seafood exports are worth far greater sums today than the groundfish ever were. But that money reaches fewer hands, in fewer boats, with fewer people cutting fish ashore. Wealth returned to the coast. Employment did not. Through the 1990s and 2000s, the young went to Halifax, to Ontario, and above all to Alberta, and a whole culture grew up around the 2-week rotation, a house in Guysborough County, a paycheck from Fort McMurray, a father home 6 days a month. Number 1. Canso, at the far eastern tip of the mainland, one of the oldest fishing settlements in North America and one of the emptiest places left in it. French crews were curing cod on this shore in the 1500s. The British raised Fort William Augustus here in the autumn of 1720, and by the 1880s, Canso had become a hinge of the planet, the point where the transatlantic telegraph cables came out of the sea and Europe touched America. The cable stations closed. The town incorporated in 1901, peaked at 1,623 in 1921, and slid through every decade after. 992 in 2001, 739 at the last count taken while it was still a town. In 2012, Canso gave up its charter entirely, unable to afford itself, and became an unincorporated community inside the district of Guysborough. Getting here is the point, 327 kilometers from Halifax, the last of it along Trunk 16, a 2-lane road through spruce barrens, where the trees shrink as the salt increases until they stand waist-high and bent inland. The fish plant is the heartbeat, and it has been through a dozen owners, closures, and restarts. Houses in Canso have listed under $100,000 with the water at the end of the yard. Number 2. Mulgrave, the fairy town the causeway killed. On the mainland side of the Strait of Canso, on a hillside dropping straight into deep water, sits a community that loyalists settled as McNair's Cove and that took the name Port Mulgrave in 1859. Its purpose arrived with the railway. For most of a century, every train bound for Cape Breton and every railcar headed for the Newfoundland boat rolled down to the Mulgrave slips and floated across the strait, and the town grew a roundhouse, a rail yard, marine crews, a lobster factory, hotels, an entire economy built on the fact that the water was in the way. In August of 1955, the Canso Causeway opened, a rock-fill barrier carrying road and rail across the strait on a single embankment, and the water stopped being in the way. Every train and every truck that had paid Mulgrave's wages went past it without slowing, 10 kilometers to the south. The town has shrunk for 70 years without pause. 722 residents in 2016, 627 in 2021, a loss of 13% in 5 years. Walk the main street on a gray October afternoon, and the scale is all wrong. Buildings sized for a rail terminal, sidewalks laid for crowds, an enormous view of the strait where ore carriers slide past toward the berths at Point Tupper. Mulgrave has one of the finest ice-free harbors on the eastern seaboard, and almost nothing tied up in it. Houses here have listed between $50,000 and $120,000. Number 3. Isle Madame, the Acadian island at the bottom of the strait. Arichat, Petit de Grat, Discus. After the fall of Louisbourg in 1758, 10 Acadian families fled from Port Toulouse to this low, wooded island off the southeastern corner of Cape Breton, and their descendants never left. Merchants from the Channel Islands came in the 1760s to run the dry cod trade, and Arichat grew into a serious port, a shipbuilding center, a customs house, the seat of a Catholic diocese. 3,136 people live across the island, and roughly 2 in 5 give French as a mother tongue. Petit de Gras, joined by a small bridge, is the working end of it. Brightly painted houses along a narrow channel, wharves crowded with lobster boats, and a fish plant that has employed most of the island at one time or another. Each closure of that plant sent another crop of school leavers to Alberta. The drive-in across Lennox Passage on a winter afternoon is a study in gray. Gray water, gray rock, gray sky, the odd fishing shed painted defiantly red. What makes Isle Madame strange is the density of a vanished prosperity. Churches too big for their congregations, merchant mansions from the age of sail, cemeteries holding more names than the villages hold. Houses list from around $50,000 for something needing work to $150,000 for a solid home with deep water at the bottom of the lawn. Number 4. The Cape Breton Coalfield, Glace Bay, New Waterford, Dominion, and Whitney Pier. This is not one town but a chain of them along 20 kilometers of cliff-edged coast, the only part of Nova Scotia that ever built cities out of industry. Glace Bay pulled a dozen colliery villages into a town in 1901 with 6,945 people and exploded from there, 20,706 by 1931, past 28,000 in the 1940s, the largest town in Canada by population. 12 collieries ran beneath it and beneath the sea offshore, some tunneling kilometers out under the Atlantic, where men worked with the ocean over their heads. Roughly 16,900 people remain. New Waterford, named for the Irish port most of its settlers came from, peaked at 10,423 in 1951 and counted 6,723 at the last census. Its defining memory is July of 1917, when methane and coal dust ignited in Number 12 colliery and killed 65 men in a single morning. The geometry tells you everything. Long, straight streets of identical company houses running toward the water, laid out for men who walked to the pit head, and at the end of them, a grassed-over mound where the pit head used to be. Almost every family here lost someone underground, and almost every family has children in Alberta. Houses in the coal towns have sold for $40,000, $60,000, $80,000. Three-bedroom homes with pressed tin ceilings, priced below the cost of the materials in them. Subscribe to show that these videos actually matter and make a difference. Number 5. Louisbourg, the fortress town that empties every October. On the outer Atlantic coast of Cape Breton, exposed to open ocean and the fog that comes with it, France began building a fortified town in 1713 that consumed between 10 and 20% of the entire French colonial budget for 2 decades running. It fell to a New England militia in 1745, was taken again in 1758, and had its walls blown flat in 1760. Beginning in the 1960s, Ottawa rebuilt roughly a quarter of the 18th century town stone by stone, partly as an unemployment project for laid-off coal miners, and the result is the largest historical reconstruction in North America. Across the harbor, the living village carried on with fishing and with coal, the Sydney and Louisbourg Railway having arrived in 1894 to load winter coal at an ice-free port. The population peaked at 1,417 in 1961, sat at 1,157 in 2001, and had fallen to 825 by 2021. Summer flatters the place. Buses, costumed interpreters, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread inside the reconstructed walls. The fortress closes for the season, the interpreters are laid off, and the town spends 7 months inside a fog thick enough that the foghorn becomes the loudest thing in anyone's life. Houses list from around $80,000, with the harbor at the end of the street. Number 6. Meat Cove, the last address in Nova Scotia. At the very top of Cape Breton Island, past the end of the Cabot Trail, past Cape North and Capstick, the pavement gives out, and 8 kilometers of gravel climbs along a cliff edge above the Cabot Strait to a shelf of green land between the mountain and the sea. Fewer than 50 people live at Meat Cove, in a scatter of houses along a brook, and no settlement stands north of them anywhere in the province. The name is blunt 18th century description, a place where crews came ashore to butcher moose and caribou. The road is the whole story. Torrential rain in August of 2010 washed it out entirely, cutting the community off until repairs were finished in October. The nearest real grocery store is well over an hour away. Sydney is roughly 200 kilometers by the coast road. Halifax is a full day. Down the shore lie the other communities at the top of the island. Bay St. Lawrence with its tiny harbor full of lobster boats. Dingwall, where a gypsum mine that shipped from its own pier closed in the 1950s. Neil's Harbor with its lighthouse on the rock. Everyone has an aging population, a school that closed, and children in Halifax or Calgary. What makes Meat Cove genuinely strange is how completely the modern world stops there. The cell signal fails, the road ends in a campground on a headland, and beyond it lies a highland plateau with no road for 80 kilometers in any direction. Property changes hands rarely and quietly, often within families. Number 7. Sable Island, the strangest inhabited place in Canada. 300 kilometers southeast of Halifax, out where the Labrador Current meets the Gulf Stream, and the fog is nearly permanent, there is a crescent of bare sand 43 kilometers long and barely more than a kilometer across at its widest, with no harbor, no trees, no road, and no bedrock. Something like 350 ships have been wrecked on its bars since the English vessel Delight went down in 1583, which earned it the name the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Nova Scotia's governor established a life-saving station here in 1801, staffed year-round by men who patrolled the beaches on horseback looking for survivors, and it operated until 1958. What remains is more than 550 wild horses, descended from animals seized from deported Acadians, and landed here by a Boston merchant in the 1760s, protected by law since 1960. The island became a national park reserve in 2013. The permanent human population is a handful of Parks Canada staff on rotation, sometimes fewer than 5 people through the winter, while the sand moves beneath them. Nobody has ever owned a house on Sable Island. It is the extreme case that every other place on this list is measured against, a piece of Nova Scotia with a population you could fit in a pickup truck, where the loudest sounds are surf, wind, and gray seals. Number 8. The Eastern Shore, the emptied corridor along Trunk 7, Ecum Secum, Necum Taich, Liscum, Sheet Harbor. Between Halifax and Canso runs one of the least traveled coastlines in eastern Canada, 300 kilometers of drowned granite shore, tea-colored rivers, offshore islands, and villages with Mi'kmaq names that visitors cannot pronounce. Sheet Harbor is the largest of them, granted in 1773 and settled around 1784 by Loyalist refugees and discharged soldiers, and it lived on timber, with mills that came and went from the 1880s onward. Roughly 800 people live in the village proper, with about 3,400 across the wider census area, and the number falls every count. The drive is the experience. 117 kilometers from Halifax, and yet whole stretches where you pass 3 vehicles in half an hour, where the highway bends inland through Spruce and back out to a cove with 4 houses and a wharf, and the school buses run enormous distances to gather a handful of children. Ecum Secum, Moser River, Spanish Ship Bay, communities of dozens rather than hundreds, with a church, a cemetery, and a line of houses facing water. Houses along this shore have listed under $100,000, with 200 meters of ocean frontage, though recent years have brought buyers from away. Number 9. Big Tancook Island, the ferry-only island in Mahone Bay. Roughly 40 minutes out from the wharf at Chester, in a bay famous for yachts and summer money, sits an island of low fields and spruce woods, where German-speaking settlers put down roots in the 1700s. The name comes from a Mi'kmaq word meaning facing the open sea, and the island has spent 3 centuries doing exactly that. Tancook built schooners, a double-ended type known by name to anyone who cares about wooden boats, and grew cabbage on every scrap of open ground, turning it into sauerkraut that went to the mainland by the barrel. Roughly 150 people live there through the winter, perhaps 200 in summer, and the figures have been drifting downward for a lifetime. There is no bridge and never has been. The ferry is the road, and when weather stops the boat, the island stops with it. No ambulance, no fire truck from away, no groceries. The elementary school is one of the last one-room schoolhouses in Canada, and the teenagers travel to Chester by boat and bus every day of the school year. Property on Tancook has sold for figures that seem impossible for oceanfront in Mahone Bay, because a boat schedule is a harder boundary than 100 kilometers of highway. Number 10. Briar Island and Westport, at the far western end of everything. To reach the westernmost point of Nova Scotia, you drive the length of Digby Neck, a basalt finger of land barely 2 kilometers wide, with the Bay of Fundy on one side, and take 2 separate ferries, one across Petit Passage to Long Island, another across Grand Passage to Briar. The island is 7.5 kilometers long, made of columnar basalt, and has recorded 57 shipwrecks. 218 people lived there at the last full accounting, in 98 year-round dwellings, all in the single village of Westport, a row of houses stacked up a hill above a harbor, crowded with lobster boats and scallop draggers. Fog sits over Briar for weeks at a time. The tide runs through the passages hard enough to stand the water up in waves, and the same currents that make the ferries a nervous business bring the plankton that brings the whales, which brings the only tourism the island has. The fishery pays well, and shrinks in headcount even as it grows in value. Houses in Westport have listed between $70,000 and $130,000, and the buyer must understand that 2 ferries stand between the front door and the nearest hospital. Number 11. Advocate Harbor, Joggins, and the Chignecto Shore. Along the north side of the Minas Channel, where the Bay of Fundy funnels the highest tides on Earth past cliffs of red sandstone, runs Route 209, one of the loneliest paved roads in mainland Nova Scotia. Advocate Harbor is a village of a few hundred behind a shingle beach piled with driftwood, its little harbor drying out completely at low water, the boats sitting on the mud twice a day, waiting. This shore built ships, hundreds of them, in yards at Advocate, Port Greville, and Diligent River, men working spruce and hackmatack into barks and schooners through the 1800s, and when steel replaced wood, the yards stopped, and nothing of comparable size ever came. The census counted 865 around Advocate in 2006, and 826 5 years later. Farther west along the same coast lies Joggins, where coal was dug as early as 1731 and industrialized by the General Mining Association from 1847. Joggins was a town from 1919 and surrendered that status in 1949. As the mining faded, the last workings closed around 1960. What saved the name was the rock itself. 15 kilometers of cliff at Joggins, scoured clean by the tides twice daily, expose a coal-age forest 310 million years old, complete with fossil trees standing where they grew, and UNESCO declared it a World Heritage Site in 2008. Houses along this shore have listed from around $60,000. Number 12. Spring Hill, the town that buried its dead 3 times. Inland, up on the Cumberland Ridge between the Minas Basin and the New Brunswick border, coal was worked from the 1870s, once the railway reached it, and a settlement of 900 people in 1881 became a town of 4,813 a decade later. Spring Hill's seams were deep, steep, and gassy, and they punished the men who worked them with a regularity that made the town's name a byword across the country. An explosion in 1891 killed 125, among them boys of 13 and 14. A second explosion in 1956 killed 39. In October of 1958, the deepest coal mine in North America suffered what miners call a bump, floor and roof slamming together under the weight of the rock, and 75 men died while the world watched the rescue on live television, one of the first disasters ever broadcast that way. The mine never reopened. Coal was finished in the district by the early 1970s, and the town has improvised ever since. A federal penitentiary, a college campus, and one remarkable idea. The abandoned workings beneath the streets flooded with groundwater the earth keeps at a steady temperature year-round. And since the late 1980s, Spring Hill has drawn heat from its own dead mines to warm the buildings above them. It was not enough. In 2015, Spring Hill dissolved itself, unable to carry its pension obligations on a shrinking tax base, and became a community inside the county of Cumberland after 126 years as a town. Around 2,300 people remain, and houses list from the low 50s. Number 13. Lockport and the Shelburne Lobster Coast. On the south shore, out past the last of the Halifax commuter belt, a peninsula in Allendale Bay carries a town founded in 1762 by 2 families from Massachusetts who wanted to be near the Grand Banks. Lockport is reached across a causeway laid along the top of a white crescent beach, which means the ocean is on both sides of the road into town, and in a storm the spray crosses it. The town lived on cod, schooners returning from the banks loaded to the rails, saltfish going out to the West Indies, molasses and rum coming back. And it was a wealthy little place, with a row of merchant houses once printed on a Canadian banknote. A market collapse in the 1890s took the first bite. In 1939, more than 600 workers were locked out in one of the defining labor fights of the Nova Scotia fishery. The groundfish closures of the 1990s took the rest. 531 people lived here in 2016, 476 at the last census, a fall of more than 10% in 5 years, and of 307 private dwellings, only 234 held a usual resident, close to a quarter of the town standing empty on census day. The lobster fishery down this coast, centered on Barrington and Woods Harbor, lands some of the most valuable catches in Canada and employs a fraction of the people the old fishery did. Houses in Lockport have listed under $100,000 within sight of that beach. Here is the riddle underneath all 13. If a sound house on the ocean costs $60,000 or $80,000 in a country where the average home changes hands for triple that, why is the for sale sign still leaning in the yard? The first answer is that a coastal winter here is not the dry, predictable cold of the prairies. It is worse in the ways that cost money. Temperatures hover around freezing and cross it constantly, which brings rain, ice, wet snow, more rain, and everything you own corrodes. Salt air eats siding, shingles, wiring, and the underside of every vehicle. Nor'easters arrive with hurricane-force gusts, and the power goes out for 2 days, or 5, at a stretch. Most of these houses burn furnace oil because gas lines were never run to a village of 90 people, and heating an old and poorly insulated home through the season can cost $3,000 or $4,000. The furnace can eat the purchase price of a cheap house inside a decade. Insurance is the quiet killer. A wood frame house on an exposed shore, kilometers from a volunteer fire hall, with rising sea levels in the underwriter's model, is expensive to insure and sometimes difficult to insure at all. The second answer is that the services left before the people did. In a village of 200, there is no doctor, and Nova Scotia has more than 100,000 residents waiting for a family physician province-wide. Emergency departments along these coasts close for days at a time for want of staff, and an ambulance from a rural station can be an hour out on a good day. The schools consolidated a generation ago, which means a 6-year-old on the eastern shore rides a bus for over an hour each way. The bank branch became an automated teller, and the teller went too. The grocery store is 40 minutes away, and the tradesman charges travel time both directions before he lifts a tool. High-speed internet has improved, and the province has spent real money on rural connectivity, but coverage remains patchy in exactly the places on this list. The job that would justify the move usually does not exist. The third answer is the one nobody writes into a listing, the weight of moving into a place everyone else has left. A town is a promise that somebody will notice if your car does not move for 3 days, that there will be a hockey team, a church supper, a class of children your own child's age. When the school closes and the co-op locks its door and the funerals outnumber the weddings by 5 to 1, that promise quietly expires, and the price of the houses is the market's honest opinion of the odds. Newcomers feel it walking down the main street even when they cannot name it, and most of them keep driving. And here the story takes a genuinely strange turn, because the last few years broke the pattern in half. Between 2020 and 2022, Nova Scotia became the destination it had spent 50 years failing to be. People arrived from Ontario, from British Columbia, from overseas, buying sight unseen over video calls, and prices rose faster than almost anywhere in the country. The average sale price across the province climbed past $480,000, and in Halifax, past $590,000. Cottage country on the South Shore was picked clean. Even Cape Breton saw listings that had sat for years disappear inside a week, which makes the corners that stayed cheap stranger than ever, because the cheapness is no longer about the province. It is about those particular harbors, those particular roads, those particular kilometers, past the point where the buyers stopped coming. The line between a village worth $400,000 and one worth $80,000 is drawn somewhere around the last place with a grocery store, and everybody on both sides of it knows exactly where it runs. What happens next is uncertain, and it is not entirely dark. Nova Scotia's population, which barely moved between 2011 and 2016, has grown at a rate unseen since the age of sail. 969,000 at the census of 2021, past 1,070,000 by the spring of 2024, with net interprovincial migration turning positive after 4 decades of bleeding people westward. The Atlantic Immigration Program, made permanent after its years as a pilot, lets employers recruit newcomers directly and has brought thousands of families into the region, and the Nova Scotia Nominee Program runs streams aimed at rural employers. Enormous industrial hopes are attached to the Strait of Canso, where a green hydrogen and ammonia project at Point Tupper, approved by the province in 2023 and costed in the billions, would draw power from new onshore wind farms and ship fuel to Europe, a development that, at the promised scale, would put paychecks within commuting distance of Mulgrave, Isle Madame, and half of Guysborough County. Remote work has genuinely repopulated a scattering of coastal villages that had been written off. The harder truth sits underneath all of it. Almost every one of those arrivals lands within an hour of Halifax, which grew by more than 9% between the last two censuses, while Guysborough County lost another 3%, and Cape Breton kept sliding. Growth here is not spreading outward along the coast. It is pooling in one place, the way water does. A modern fish plant runs with a fraction of the hands. A wind farm employs hundreds to build and a dozen to operate. The province is getting fuller, and the far shores are still emptying, at the same time, on the same map. Some of these 13 will steady themselves as retirement villages and summer places. Some will follow the arithmetic all the way down, house by house, census by census, until the last resident is buried in the cemetery on the hill, and somebody's grandson comes back once a year to cut the grass around the stones. Drive Trunk 7 eastward some evening in late October. When the light goes early, the spruce closes in on both sides, and the wet road ahead is the color of pewter. Roll the window down at one of the coves. You will hear surf on granite, a halyard tapping in a boatyard, wind moving through a place that once had a wharf, a store, a school, and 200 children, and holds 40 people mostly over 65. Nova Scotia has been leaving these harbors for a century, one boat and one boy at a time, and the houses cost almost nothing because the price was never the point. The point was the fish, and the coal, and the ships, and the neighbors, and 3 of those 4 are gone. Look after yourselves out there, wherever you are watching from. And if you ever find yourself on a coast road after dark, and you catch one lit kitchen window, standing alone against all that water, slow down for a moment. Somebody is still home.